Welcome, everybody, to our fourth program in a series of 5 programs this academic year on the subject of immigration to the United States, of course, that kind of immigration. My name is Tom Morgan. I am the director of the Allworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth. And as I said, this is the fourth in a series of 5 programs on this topic of immigration. Delighted you're here, delighted you found us through the ether. Our programs, as always, are sponsored, of course, by the Allworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice at St. Scholastica, and we're particularly grateful to the Allworth family for helping to endow and support these programs. They're also funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Ivre Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Ivre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, the Royal D. Alworth Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private sources, private donors. Thank you all very much for your support for these programs year after year. You make it happen by coming, by supporting it, and by your generous donations. If you're new to this or want to get closer to it, you can sign up to get regular email messages from me about upcoming programs, and or you can also receive postcards in the mail on a regular basis about upcoming programs. My email address is right, I think, below my face there on the screen, tmorgan@css.edu. Send me an email. If you want to be on our email mailing list, send me your street address. If you want to receive postcards, send me both if you want both. Happy to do it. At the end of the program, as we always do, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. There's a button, there should be a button on your screen. It says Q&A. I invite you to type in a question, and I will be reading them and sort of filtering through them and combining them if some of the questions are sort of repetitive. And I'll put the questions to our speaker, and we'll continue that for a while afterwards. I encourage you to ask questions. As I say to my students, hold the speaker's feet to the fire. That always makes it most interesting, and sometimes the Q&A can be really lively. It oftentimes is. So I invite you to ask questions at the end of the presentation. One of the founders of this program, one of the initial contributors to it, of course, was Martha Allworth, who passed away a little more than 8 years ago. And she was one of the spark plugs for getting this program started. And in her memory, in her honor, we like to acknowledge her at least once a year at one of these lectures that we call the Martha Allworth Memorial Lecture, and that's what we're doing right now. I have something to read here. It was written by Royal Allworth III, and that's Martha's son, together with Karen Allworth, Royal's wife. So this is what they had to say about Martha. She called Duluth her home, but she was truly a citizen of the world. During her life, she worked with and supported numerous organizations that promoted peace and justice locally, nationally, and internationally. Here at CSS, she established the Allworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice as a way to bring important issues to the attention of her community and especially the next generation. This year's theme of immigration was personal for Martha. Martha was proud of her Irish heritage and would tell of help wanted ads in newspapers, ending with, Irish need not apply. She viewed many aspects of U.S. immigration policy as a form of discrimination. We remember and honor Martha Allworth this evening with tonight's annual memorial lecture. Now on to the lecture. As many of you know, many of the participants in this lecture series travel considerable distance to speak to us in the Mitchell Auditorium on our campus here in Duluth. This year, of course, we've welcomed voices from some distance via Zoom. This evening's speaker is a hometown voice, however. She's been a part of our Duluth community since 2002 when she began serving as the minister at Pilgrim Congregational Church. Before that, she served congregations in Indiana, Montana, Iowa, and the Twin Cities. She holds a Masters in Divinity degree from Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Reverend Frantz was born and raised in Eastern Pennsylvania and grew up as a member of a Christian denomination that didn't accept women as ministers. Indeed, even when she was ordained by the United Church of Christ in 1975, it was rare for a woman to serve as a parish minister. So it appears that our speaker was a pioneer from the beginning of her professional life. Some years ago, Reverend Frantz adopted as a single parent Alex, a boy from Guatemala, whom she raised here in Duluth. She and Alex together have returned to Guatemala 5 times to visit his family and do volunteer work there. Alex currently is living in St. Paul, working in the culinary arts and helping to provide community meals in Ramsey County. Our speaker retired from active ministry in 2015, but continues to remain active in community affairs, and in particular has been an avid advocate for the refugee population in Duluth. Oh yes, and she also devotes time to gardening around her home here in Duluth. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Reverend Charlotte Frantz.
And Charlotte, if you could start your video as well.
Let me give you the cue again.
I can't get it started.
Oh, okay, 1 second.
I guess I don't need to give the cue again.
No, we're good. There you
Okay,
go.
there she is.
Well, first of all, Tom, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I am no means an expert in immigration. Preparing for this evening has been somewhat challenging, in part precisely because the topic is so very timely. I actually wrote a sentence into it this morning once I had read the news. What is happening to immigrants? What kind of reform does our immigration system need? How important is our local involvement now that we have a new administration? You asked me to look at all of these questions through the lens of my own experience and the work of a local group here in Duluth. So I want to begin with a few words. I'm trying to get a PowerPoint up here, so just let me try to get that taken care of.
All right, that looks good.
All right. I want to begin with a few words about why this subject is important to me, and then I want to take a look at the way in which racism has been embedded in the history of immigration law. Then I'll look briefly at the changes that are proposed by the Biden administration, and then finish with a review of the work that's been done by the Interfaith Committee for Migrant Justice here in Duluth. I'm aware that that's a lot to pack in, but we'll see what the next 50 minutes bring and hopefully have some good discussion afterwards. For whom the American dream? Immigration, racism, and welcome. Like many European descendant baby boomers, I grew up in the American post-World War II era that was made possible by the production of cheap automobiles, the expansion of highway systems, and my father's access to the GI Bill. My family lived in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our immigrant roots went back at least 3 generations. Some of my ancestors had come to this continent prior even to the Revolutionary War. We children were taught that our forebears came from England and Poland, and on both sides of our parentage, Germany. My grandparents lived in Eastern Pennsylvania, where German influences were filtered through the culture of the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Statue of Liberty in New York epitomizes my childhood and adolescent understandings of immigration. The poem by Emma Lazarus is on its base. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. My family took these words to heart. They are a secular version of the religious faith we practiced. We were members of a Lutheran church and supported the work of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. My father was a lay leader in our local congregation when we took responsibility for resettling some Cuban refugees in the early 60s. He advocated on their behalf. He recruited volunteers and set up committees and justified the use of church funds and located the necessary housing for them. And then when my aunt's congregation later became involved in settling Vietnamese refugees, she took major responsibility for a particular family. She arranged doctor's appointments and English language lessons. She babysat the children. She commandeered sewing machines for their first business venture. She shepherded them through appointments and naturalization ceremonies. She went to graduations and weddings and funerals, not only for the generation who first came, but also for their children and grandchildren. Give me your tired, your poor. The call resonates not only with Judeo-Christian faith, but with other spiritual traditions as well. In one way or another, all the spiritual traditions with which I am familiar call their adherents to care for those who are among the least, the hungry, the poor, the homeless, the incarcerated, the ill, all those who are yearning for some sort of freedom. In October 2018, the Aurich-Alpern Interreligious Forum, which is also connected, by the way, with the College of St. Scholastica, invited me to participate in a panel discussion on immigration. The participants represented Indigenous, Catholic Christian, Protestant Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faith traditions. We panelists talked at length about the title for this event and finally developed a consensus around the words sacred responsibility. For each of us, the work of caring for immigrants and establishing justice is a faithful and sacred responsibility. And so this is where I need to begin. This work is grounded in a shared spiritual perspective. Ricky Defoe, an Anishinaabe pipe carrier and elder from the Fond du Lac, frames immigration conversations within the context of migration. Migration is natural, he says. It is as natural as the flow of the water in the river or the movement of wind in the air. Animals migrate, birds migrate, seeds migrate, people migrate, everything migrates. Everything seeks to live. Everything seeks a better life. If there's not enough food, if there's some sort of devastation in the land, all that lives there will migrate because there is in our spirit the will for a better life. We cause disruption when we try to stop migration. Instead of stopping it, we need to accept it as natural. Those who migrate are fleeing from something that threatens them and are seeking a place to live safely. And it is incumbent on us to offer hospitality, to give them a chance not just to live, but to thrive. This context, which Ricky offers, suggests to me that migration is not about geography, or land. It is not about economics or political alignment. It is not about alienation or assimilation. It is at its very root about life. We've made it into all of those other things. But fundamentally, migration is the drive to live well. It is about the drive to sustain one's own life and the life of one's family, and most especially the life of one's children. It is a natural phenomenon. Whether or not we are aware of immigrants in our midst, whether or not we actively engage with them, whether or not we choose to get to know them or advocate on their behalf. Immigrants shape the context of our lives as much as the wind and the water, the animal, birds and plants, rocks and dirt. They help shape the very context of our lives. Rabbi Steinberg from Temple Israel here in Duluth told stories that night from the Jewish traditions, sacred stories about Abraham and Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, stories about families who migrated at God's behest. They traveled from place to place as sojourners. They lived among peoples as aliens. They knew what it meant to live in unfamiliar places and to live among unfamiliar traditions and to long for home and to depend on others for the basic essentials of life. Because these were our ancestors, because we carry their nomadic spirits within our hearts, we are enjoined by the God Yahweh to treat the alien and the sojourner as a citizen, as one of us. For, said Yahweh, you were once a sojourner. Jesus is central to Christian teachings, and he spent his childhood as a refugee. Before the age of 2, he and his parents fled across the border to Egypt because mad King Herod was afraid of this child. In one of the most classic of Jesus' later teachings, he said, when you feed the hungry or give the thirsty something to drink, when you give clothing to those in need or house those who are homeless, when you visit the sick or the imprisoned, whatever you do to these the least, you do it to me. So for Christians, the one in need, the one who is without, the one who is oppressed, is the Savior himself. Yusuf Abdi, Director of Refugee Services for Lutheran Social Services in Minnesota, spoke that night from the perspective of his own Muslim faith. He talked about sacred journeys, including his own family's journey as refugees from Somalia. He talked about Islam's multiple instructions about caring for the traveler, the foreigner, the one who's different. Those who travel are sacred to Allah, and their pilgrimages are to be blessed by the righteous. As human beings, you see, we are called to protect the sacredness and dignity of life. We are called to do justice. And for many, many of us, this is a sacred responsibility. We're called to do justice as individuals, and we are also called to establish social systems that deliver justice. Though we may espouse this dream that the country welcomes and provides immigrants with unimaginable opportunities, American history tells us a very different story. And it is this different story that many of us still need to learn. So a little about our national story. The history of immigration is no different from other histories to which many Americans are just now awakening. Racism has been deeply embedded from the very start. The first immigration law in the United States was passed in 1790. This law granted naturalized citizenship to free white persons who were foreign-born but had lived in the United States for 2 years. According to the practice of that time, of course, free white persons meant free white males. Anti-immigration sentiment led to the raising of the residency requirement to 5 years in 1795. And interesting, that's still the standard time frame for immigrants. Most must be a permanent resident, that is, they have to have a green card for 5 years before they're eligible for citizenship. Throughout the 19th century, most immigrants arriving on the East Coast were from Northern and Western Europe, or East Asia. They settled the vast American frontier. They provided cheap labor for factories in the Northeast and agriculture in the South and the Midwest. On the West Coast, Chinese immigrants came to work in the mines, in agriculture, and eventually in factories until 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned any additional Chinese immigrants. The myth that we are, except for Native Americans, a nation of immigrants might well be challenged by the slave history of the South and the Mexican story of the Southwest. Slave trade brought Africans to this country as captives. They did not come seeking a better life. They and their descendants were not granted citizenship until after the Civil War in 1868. In the Southwest, some families never crossed the border. They say the border crossed them. In 1848, at the end of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo moved the United States border considerably south. A huge tract of land that had belonged to Mexico became territory of the United States. This includes much of what is now California, Texas, parts of Colorado, northern Arizona and New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. Just think that's a huge swath of geography. In 1854, the Gadsden Purchase added southern Arizona and New Mexico to this massive land transfer. Now, those who lived in that land had been Mexicans. Now they became Americans of Mexican descent. They were not immigrants like those who had come from Europe. You see, our mythological history of immigration ignores that story, and its absence is another manifestation of our national racist origins. And Native Americans, whose history includes massacres and forced marches, betrayals by the government and broken treaties, they were not granted citizenship until 1924. You see, if we are a nation of immigrants and their descendants, then we are also a nation of those who were brought here as captives and their descendants. And we are also a nation of those whose lands and nationality were ceded or purchased and their descendants. And we are a nation of natives who survived against great odds and their descendants. Our history is complex and difficult. And to say that we are, quote, a nation of immigrants, unquote, perpetuates the racism at our core. Early in the 20th century, increasing turmoil in Europe resulted in immigrants coming from Russia and Austria and Italy. They included a significant number of Catholics and Jews. Anti-immigrant sentiment fueled by World War I led to the National Origins Act in 1924. This act established a visa system and country-by-country quotas. Quotas were based on the ratio of different ethnic groups already in the United States. Congress chose as baseline data, not 1924 when the act was passed, but the census of 1890, which was 34 years prior. And it was before the waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. According to the National Park Service official website, quote, these country-by-country limits were specifically designed to keep out undesirable ethnic groups and maintain America's character as a nation of Northern and Western European stock, unquote. About the same time, Mexican descendant Americans in the Southwest found themselves vulnerable to racist policies. In 1930, about 1 million of them were forcibly deported back to Mexico. Although it's hard to establish the exact number, some historians estimate that as many as 60% of the deportees were actually US citizens. They had been born in the United States, and most of them had never visited Mexico. Does that have a familiar ring to any of you? Although the National Origins Act in 1924 remained the base for immigration policies for 40 years, there were occasional modifications to accommodate specific labor needs. Let me give you one example. The Bracero program was established to recruit agricultural workers, but these migrants were not eligible for permanent residency. They were paid low wages, and their children were not allowed to attend public school. A study of immigration history called Recommit to Racial Justice was published by the Catholic Network Advocates. And in that study, the authors concluded, and I quote, "A noticeable pattern emerges throughout our nation's history of immigration. When the economy needs immigrant labor, restrictions decline and immigrants are welcomed. However, if circumstances change and immigrant labor is no longer needed, the United States' position on immigration shifts to restriction, deportation, and xenophobic rhetoric." In the mid-1960s, alongside the monumental legislation like the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, immigration policies underwent significant change. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 did away with the national quotas that favored immigration from Northern Europe and Germany, and instead prioritized family reunification and relationships. It also did away with national quotas, established a system of visas for needed labor, both skilled and unskilled, and included provisions for refugees. Despite claims that the Immigration and Naturalization Act would not substantially change our national demographics, this revolutionary legislation helped increase in our nation ethnic and racial diversity. The first speaker in this series, Tom Jelton, is an NPR correspondent, and in his lecture, he addressed the significance of this legislation, placed it in the context of other reforms of the 1960s, and explored the backlash that we've witnessed in recent years. His talk, by the way, is available through the College of St. Scholastica Peace and Justice website. And if you're further interested in this, I would commend this to you because it's particularly good at linking the immigration reform and civil rights. For many years, immigration oversight was housed in the Treasury Department because the government's interest in immigration was primarily in collecting taxes and tariffs from incoming ships. In 1903, the government's attention became more clearly focused on protecting American workers and wages. Customs and immigration was moved to a newly created Labor and Commerce Department. Shortly thereafter, the federal government took on the task of creating a uniform process for naturalization and formed a new agency, Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is commonly known as INS. According to the official government website, in the period just prior to World War II, INS activities turned increasingly towards law enforcement, devoting more resources to investigation, exclusion, prevention of illegal entry, deportation of criminal and subversive aliens. In 1940, the agency was moved from the Department of Labor and Commerce to the Department of Justice. The federal government, you see what's happening? The federal government's understanding about what it meant to oversee immigration had moved from economic interest in collecting taxes to an interest in protecting American jobs and regulating the impact of immigration on the labor force, and then to increasing immigration law, deportation, and assisting in investigations that were being conducted by the Justice Department. So this becomes the progression. The immigrant as a source of revenue, becomes the immigrant as a source of labor, to the immigrant as potentially engaged in illegal activity. And that progression, I believe, laid the foundations for the more recent criminalization of immigrants, especially asylum seekers at the southern border. As I studied this history, I felt an increasingly disturbing gap between the words of the Statue of Liberty and the practice of our federal government. And then, in response to the events of 9/11/2001, the Bush administration reorganized departments and agencies of the federal government which had responsibility for national security. Parts of 22 different departments and agencies were brought together into something new, the Department of Homeland Security. And what had been the INS in the Justice Department became the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services housed in the Department of Homeland Security. So now immigration enforcement would be carried out in the context of protecting national security from threats of terrorism. I think that has a lot to do with why we are here today. My own personal encounters with the INS and then the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services began in 1999, when I applied to bring a child adopted in Guatemala to the United States. I will not relate to you the confusion and the frustration that was a part of that process. But what I will share is the deep impression that confusion and frustration left in my heart. I concluded one evening in my own personal journal. Here I am, an American citizen, a native speaker with a post-college education. I was taught to trust that my government was to be of assistance to its citizens. Now, if I cannot make sense of the questions on the forms I need to fill out, if I cannot ask a question and receive an intelligible answer, if I cannot figure out how to access the information that I need, how in the world do immigrants manage? How do they manage if they don't speak English well, or if they have a limited education, or if they come from a place where the government has traumatized or terrorized or simply ignored them? How do they do it? I look back now, almost 2 decades later, and I realized that I was naive and inexperienced and privileged. And so were most of the other adoptive parents whose experiences were much like mine. That experience gave me lasting admiration for those who come to this country from someplace else. Their persistence and endurance, not only through the physical and emotional traumas of their journeys, but in the face of our government's processes, totally amazes me. And what they have endured in the last 4 years is almost unspeakable. The Trump administration turned many immigrant dreams into nightmares. The Obama administration had prioritized for deportation immigrants with criminal records. Some of them were minor infractions from years past. Trump, however, broadened the scope of those eligible for deportation. Immigrants found their lives increasingly precarious, and deportations increased throughout the country. Those who came to the United States to seek asylum or to reunite with families or to engage in advanced studies had an increasingly difficult time. Some actions by the Trump administration raised public outcry: the separation of families, children in cages, deplorable conditions and lack of oversight in detention facilities, the institution of migrant protection protocols commonly known as the Wait in Mexico policy, Muslim majority travel bans, the suspension of DACA protection. But there were other policies and changes that were scarcely covered in the mainline media. military recruits who were on the path to citizenship in recognition of their military service were suddenly and without explanation discharged. Work visas became more difficult to obtain. Permanent residency and citizenship applications were rejected if lines were left blank. You had to fill in not applicable so that the line had something in it. Fees for applications, including the renewal of DACA protection, were raised. Immigration judges were limited in their ability to open and close cases. Some actions were restrained by judicial injunctions. Some raised enough public outcry that the administration changed tactics. Some were simply instituted without regard to public outrage or international conventions. Lucas Gutentag, a law professor from Stanford and Yale and founding director of the American Civil Liberties Immigrant Rights Project, compiled a database of every change the Trump administration made to the immigration system. He, with the help of 70 students, listed 1,064 separate immigration-related changes made between 2017 and 2021. Changes affected both legal and illegal immigration, and their intent was to reduce the number of foreign-born non-citizens in the United States. I am convinced that the motivation for these actions is rooted in racism and precipitated by the increasing numbers of Black, Brown, and Asian immigrants for whom the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act opened the door. Some came seeking asylum, some came as refugees, some came to study and wanted to stay to work. Some came because they were recruited by employers and wanted to bring along their families. Despite all the rhetoric we hear about aliens, in quotes, crossing the border illegally and threatening our national security, the majority of undocumented persons in the United States are persons who came with legal visas and have overstayed their expiration date. Most of them have invested in the communities where they live. According to the Migrant Policy Institute, 62%, which is almost 2/3, of unauthorized immigrants have lived in the United States a decade or more. 67% are in the workforce, and 34% own their own homes. These are people who are invested in their communities and are productive. After reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, in which she parallels the Jim Crow era and today's mass incarceration of Black bodies, it occurred to me that in many ways, the treatment of Black and Brown immigrants parallels the racist treatment visited on Indigenous persons. Think of the similarities: the separation of families, the demand for assimilation to a dominant white culture, deportations, very much like forced removal from home, the governmental disregard for agreed upon protocols and procedures and conventions and treaties. Just as treaties were broken, for example, international conventions regarding asylum seekers and refugees have been ignored by our government. What I think we dare not forget, the racist practices of the past 4 years are not an anomaly that are likely to disappear because a new administration is in place. The treatment of immigrants which we have witnessed is firmly rooted in our national history and character, and evident in our policies and practices. It makes me sad to reach that conclusion. We're only a little more than 6 weeks into a new administration, and I can tell you there are remarkable signs of hope. The American dream, that strangers can find both refuge and opportunity, has not been destroyed. On the evening when the election results were announced, Vice President Kamala Harris paid tribute to her mother with these words, quote, "When she came here from India at the age of 19, maybe she didn't quite imagine this moment, but she believed so deeply in an America where a moment like this is possible," unquote. Biden's cabinet selections and agency appointments represent an amazing array of cultural and ethnic heritages honed by education and experience. It is no small thing that the Secretary for Homeland Security is Alejandro Mayorkas, a Cuban-born refugee brought to the United States as a child. He was one of the architects of the DACA program, and he served in the Obama administration. Immediately after his inauguration, President Biden began to roll back orders put in place by the Trump administration. Almost immediately, Biden took the following actions. He revoked Trump's 2017 Interior Enforcement Executive Order and thus narrowed the categories of undocumented immigrants subject to removal. He ended the travel ban against Muslim majority countries. He strengthened the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and reinstated protection for certain immigrants brought to the United States as children. He terminated the emergency orders by which Trump had diverted funding to the construction of the wall at the southern border. He suspended new enrollments in MPP protocols, more commonly known as WAIT in Mexico. He paused most deportations for 100 days to give time for policies to be reviewed. However, there was a district judge named Drew Tipton in Texas who almost immediately ordered a temporary restraining order. And in fact, deportations continued, most of the flights going to either Haiti or Kenya. He reinstated the deferred enforced departure for Liberians, and he revoked the exclusion of undocumented persons from the 2020 census. Since his first week in office, Biden's administration has taken some additional actions. Let me give you just a few of the examples. The State Department suspended the asylum cooperative agreement with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Biden indicated that he'd like to raise the number of refugees next year to 125,000. He's floating the possibility of raising the number of refugees for this fiscal year from 15,000 to 60,000. The maximum number of refugees is established by the Congress, not by the executive branch of the government. By executive order, Biden established a task force to identify and locate children and families that are still separated as a result of Trump's zero tolerance policy. As of this week, the ACLU reported having located 112 parents, with 499 still being sought. Asylum seekers that were sent to Mexico to wait are slowly being processed through the ports of entry in San Diego, Brownsville, and El Paso. Processing there began on February 19th, and there are people from the United Nations assisting in that processing. All of those actions roll back the previous administration's anti-immigration policies and practices. Although immensely important, they do not fundamentally change the immigration system. They only undo some of the most objectionable actions from the recent years. It's probably worth noting that there are at least two policies currently in the news that are both related to COVID-19. Biden has not rescinded Title 42, which allows refusing entry based on public health crisis. And his administration is reopening a facility in Texas to house unaccompanied minors. And I've heard conflicting reports about the possibility of opening the facility at Homestead, Florida. Both facilities had been closed down after investigations into the conditions there. The reason they're being reopened is that thousands of unaccompanied minors are arriving at the border and they are being admitted. but they need to be housed somewhere while awaiting processing by Health and Human Services and undergoing a 14-day quarantine for COVID. So those are two issues that are currently kind of controversial, and that where Biden has not taken steps to do something different. On February 18th, just 2 weeks ago, Robert Mendoza, Democratic senator from New Jersey, introduced the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 to the Senate. On the same day, Linda Sanchez, Democratic representative from California, introduced that same bill to the House of Representatives. According to the White House briefing room, the bill has three primary sections and purposes. First, to provide a pathway to citizenship and protect labor. Secondly, to prioritize smart border controls. And thirdly, to address root causes of migration. In brief, the proposed legislation creates a roadmap for citizenship for undocumented individuals. As many as 11 million would be able to apply for temporary legal status immediately and then permanent resident status after 5 years. There are some, such as dreamers, temporary protection status holders, and some immigrant farm workers who would be eligible for green cards immediately and can apply to become citizens after 3 years. Applicants must all have been present in the United States on or before January 1st, 2021. Language is really important, and the words that we use to describe immigrants, both in informal speech and in legislation, reflects and reveals attitude. The word alien has been used in immigrant legislation since the founding of this nation. Perhaps one of the most reformative aspects of this bill is that it uses a different word. It uses the word non-citizen instead of the word alien. Dr. Kevin Johnson of the University of California, Davis wrote this, and I quote, "Some might think that terminology is not a big deal, but as a scholar of immigration and civil rights law, I believe that this one word change could deeply influence Americans' views about the rights of non-citizens, and by so doing, the future trajectory of immigration law and policy. For this reason alone, the Citizenship Act of 2021 provides a much needed reform." This major piece of legislation addresses many of the difficulties that immigrants encounter in our present system. I want to list just some of those items that are included. It includes the elimination of lengthy wait time for family members and makes increasing numbers of visas available. Currently, there are 4 countries from whom family members may have to wait as long as 20 years to be brought to this country by relatives or sponsors. This bill includes the expansion and funding of programs by government and partner organizations to assist in resettlement and preparation for citizenship. It includes the retention of foreign-born graduates from US universities who want to stay and work in this country. It includes improved access to permanent resident status for lower wage earners, such as those who are in the hospitality industry, agriculture, food processing, and personal care. It includes protection for migrant and seasonal workers, and it increases the penalties for employers who break labor laws. Did you notice that when there were workplace raids and immigrants were rounded up and deported, there were hardly ever any employers who faced charges for having hired those folks in the first place? In terms of border security, the US Citizenship Bill in 2021 includes the following provisions. It supplements current border resources with technology to expedite screening and identification of narcotics and other contraband. It increases infrastructure to counter the flow of narcotics. It provides training to increase professionalism and safety among the Border Patrol. It creates a border community stakeholder advisory committee. It requires department-wide policies governing the use of force. It requires the development of standards of care for individuals and families and children in Border Patrol custody. It enhances the ability to prosecute individuals who are involved in smuggling and human trafficking. The bill also addresses, to at least some extent, the root causes of migration. It requires the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies to expand transnational anti-gang activities. It calls for increasing assistance to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to reduce the corruption, violence, and poverty there. It establishes designated processing centers throughout Central America to register and process displaced persons for refugee resettlement, either in the United States or in other partner countries. It provides for reuniting children with US relatives. It reduces backlogs in immigration courts and expands training for immigration judges and improves technology related to court proceedings. The bill also eliminates the one-year deadline for filing asylum claims and provides funding to reduce asylum application backlogs. If this all sounds very complicated and complex, let me assure you, you're right, it is. Elizabeth Hall, Rutgers University law professor, quipped and then got quoted in a number of other articles when she said, immigration law is second only to IRS codes in complexity. The US Citizenship Act of 2021 addresses many of the major concerns expressed by immigrants and immigrant advocates and law enforcement agencies. However, this is my fear. Given the state of American politics at the moment, one could be forgiven for wondering how much of this can be enacted. Some critics say the legislation goes too far. Some say it does not go far enough. Some major concerns, such as the toll the wall has taken on the environment and the damage done to ancestral lands along the southern border, for example, are not even included or touched in this legislation. Still, Biden has offered a large and comprehensive package. Congress will decide how much of that package will be passed, what the final package would look like, and indeed, whether it will be passed at all. If our nation is to change our immigration system, if we are to welcome those who come to us for opportunities they would not have elsewhere, if we are to live by the light of Lady Liberty's lantern, we must pay attention to this legislation and the discussions that it will inevitably engender. The issues of immigration reform will not dissolve or self-correct. Though some of us, and I would imagine most of us here tonight, would welcome President Biden's bold and brave vision for immigration reform, there is a vicious anger seething throughout our country. We've seen the power of white supremacy at Charlottesville and at the Capitol. Some Americans perceive the increasing prominence of Black, Brown, Indigenous people, other people of color, as the end to an American dream. An end to the dream of a nation owned and controlled by those with light skin, European heritage, and white privilege. You see, this too is an American dream, and it is tightly held by its adherents. It has a long history, and it is woven inextricably into the fabric of our national life. Already, disinformation is being spread to further anti-immigrant sentiment. Just last night, after announcing the rollback of COVID-19 mitigation efforts in Texas and declaring that now is the time to open, the governor there responded to health officials' concern, at least according to Heather Richardson Cox, by tweeting that immigrants now being processed at the border are the ones bringing COVID to his state. And as I was originally writing this paragraph in early February, I listened to Jim Jordan, who's the US representative from Ohio, raising fears in Texas that the COVID outbreak there was due to the release of detainees. Last winter, when our own county commissioners had tabled a resolution to welcome refugees, I saw how quickly misinformation could be spread and how firmly it could take hold in a community. If we are to change the way immigrants are treated in this country, ordinary citizens of goodwill and truth-telling must counter the vitriol that continues to be stirred up. Ordinary citizens must continue to advocate for immigrants, for immigration reform, and for the American dream of cultural and ethnic diversity. Ordinary citizens must insist upon respect for one another and for compassion in the treatment of those whose lives have been upended by circumstances beyond their control. In Duluth, we do not have identifiable immigrant communities as many larger cities do. Immigrants here are pretty much integrated into our community life. They serve in professional positions. They're part of our medical, educational, business, and commercial institutions. They work in the hospitality industry and in care facilities. They live in our neighborhoods. They are part of our families. Sometimes I think they are so much a part of life in Duluth that the dominant culture tends to overlook them. And at the UMD summit this afternoon, I heard a woman say, "I feel like I'm invisible in Duluth." In 2016, I was recently retired and I was fearful in the wake of the presidential election. I decided that I needed to pick one issue and really focus my energy there. And so I chose to pay particular attention to news about immigration and immigration policies. And beyond that, I had no plan and no idea, and I certainly had no idea what the next 4 years would bring. As deportations across the country increased, communities of faith were exploring how to offer sanctuary space to undocumented immigrants. The Reverend Kathy Nelson was then pastor of Peace Church, where I'm a member. She asked me if I would serve on a team to shepherd the congregation through learning about immigration and then making a decision. In September 2017, Peace declared itself a sanctuary congregation. It even began to modify space in the building should an individual or a family need to take sanctuary there. Members of our sanctuary team visited other congregations, and I visited with other pastors in the community. Gradually, we found allies and built a support network of folks interested in immigration advocacy. About the same time, members of First Lutheran Church, who have had a long-standing relationship with a sister parish in El Salvador, became concerned about the increasing anti-immigration policies and rhetoric in the national news. Brooks Anderson, a retired campus minister and a veteran activist, uttered what became a fateful sentence during a discussion at First Lutheran. "Isn't it time we took this concern to the streets?" he asked. "It's one thing to sit here and talk about immigration policies, but maybe it's time for us to let the community and our leaders know how disturbed we are." And so this group from First Lutheran invited other congregations to join them in planning an interfaith prayer vigil to be held in a public space on a Sunday afternoon. We expected this to be a one-time event. And so Sunday, June 23rd, 2019, was unseasonably cold and it was very wet. People gathered at the Minnesota Power Plaza and then walked to the steps of the Federal Building. An array of spiritual leaders spoke or sent written statements. We sang, we prayed, we issued a call to communities of faith and people of conscience to join us. We got drenched in the rain. And by the grace of God or Creator or Spirit or Allah, at one of our final planning meetings, someone suggested that we should draft a petition to our congressional representatives. And so there in the rain, we gathered signatures. I'm sure some of them are well smeared past recognition. But that simple act necessitated something we hadn't expected. We had to have a post-prayer vigil meeting. We needed to figure out what to do with these petitions. And thus began the Interfaith Committee for Migrant Justice. We are loosely organized and we meet on an as-needed basis. As needed, incidentally, has averaged twice a month for almost 2 years. We've continued to learn from and with one another. We have communicated with and visited public officials. Pre-COVID, we made presentations to groups and we hosted several community forums where individuals reported on trips they had made to the southern border. We connected individuals from Duluth who wanted to make such trips with groups that were sponsoring trips and still had openings. When the federal government proposes rule changes, those changes are posted on a federal registry, and there's a period of time for public comment. So several members of our group studied anticipated rule changes related to immigrants and made presentations and drafted postcards and distributed them. When the public charge rule was up for comment, I took 250 postcards to the post office. When the issue of refugee resettlement was tabled by the St. Louis County Commissioners, ICMJ had speakers at every county commissioner meeting for months. We've hosted additional prayer vigils. We rallied during World Refugee Day last June. We've attended webinars and Zoom discussions with advocates in the Twin Cities and Arizona and California. We've connected with asylum detainees, and we offered 3 of them support and welcome when they were released. And they actually came here to Duluth from California and Arizona. We connected with other groups led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We've been asked to help with driver's licenses for all, a campaign to eliminate Department of Motor Vehicles discrimination related to immigration status. We have a Facebook page where we post information and links to articles about immigration issues. While encouraging his students to commit to racial justice work, Professor Rasha Diab wrote, "Our seemingly small interventions will bring tides of change in the years to come." I believe that ICMJ and other local advocacy groups made up of ordinary people are part of bringing tides of change. We have a large email list of folks who are interested in learning along with us. We're making connections with groups in other places. We rely on each other. We seek to be an oasis of welcome for those who come to us and for those who are already among us. Mo Cantor, one of the directors of New American Economy, wrote this, and I quote, "The success of immigration reform will depend not just on leadership from Washington, but also, and more importantly, on local communities stepping up to make sure immigrants are able to succeed and be full and active members of their communities. Things will not truly change until hearts and minds actively welcome immigrants and until our policies and procedures are rooted in justice. The challenge is great. To live out the sacred responsibilities as taught in our various faith traditions, to broaden our understanding of our national history, to root out racism that is so firmly a part of our national character. Washington legislators can give us a more just process, but it will take many of us to make the American dream a possibility." I'm a parish pastor, and I'm not one who issues altar calls. But tonight, I want to invite you, find a way to become a part of this work. Advocate for, welcome, and support new immigrants. They will contribute to the American dream of opportunity and possibility. Thank you very much.
There, now I'm back. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for a very inspiring talk. And I'm speaking for myself, but I think I speak for others. I think you contributed a good deal to this whole lecture series. You added another vision that we all needed to hear. And and you were the cleanup hitter, number 4 in this series. So congratulations. Questions have already started to come in. So I think I'll just start putting them to you. And some of these questions are complex, and I think I'm just going to read a couple of them to you directly rather than try to paraphrase them. So are you ready? Here goes. How are you, number 1, how are you so optimistic about immigration under the Biden administration when he served as Obama's vice president, which was actually harsher on immigrants than Trump? Trump's deportation was significantly lower than Obama's, with Obama deporting 1.6 million during his first term, whereas 935,000 during Trump's administration. You mentioned children in cages at the border during Trump's administration. Obama's administration was the one that built those cages. How will Biden's administration be better when he was a part of Obama's harsher treatment of immigrants?
I'll go back to the beginning of that question, which is how can you be optimistic?
Okay.
I think I don't have any choice but to be optimistic, because if I gave in to despair, then I would be paralyzed and not be able to do anything. And I feel as if Biden is stepping out in a way that perhaps was not possible 8 years ago, 12 years ago. So I don't want to give in to a sense of resignation based on the actions that happened prior to Trump being there. I want to give the benefit of new possibilities to Biden and to his administration.
Okay. Do you think Biden's, all right, here's another one connected with Biden. Do you think Biden's order of an airstrike in Syria will diminish immigration from the Middle East?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I think that one's out of the scope of what I know. And I don't know a lot, but I try to be clear about what I do know and what I don't know.
All right, then try this one. What do you foresee being the most effective method of changing messaging and public sentiment surrounding immigration?
I think it's really important that about this and many other issues, that we learn to be careful about speaking the truth. And I think the truth has been a big casualty of the last 4 years, probably before that even. But for example, just in terms of my own research and then information that I share with people, I always make sure that I can corroborate it among various credible sources, not a single credible source. So I think the way we talk to our next door neighbors or our students or our colleagues in the office, I mean, I think it's incumbent on each of us to do what we can to put forth public perceptions that are generous rather than denigrating to immigrants.
Here's another hard question. Thank you for your answer. Talking about the St. Louis County Board and the action that they took to officially say that refugees were not welcome in St. Louis County.
I don't think they took that stance. I think they pulled it back. In a sense, they decided not to decide because they tabled it.
I beg your pardon.
For a very long time, and then
I stand corrected. Yes, but still, the question is out there. Could you characterize the nature of what you think their anxiety was? What was the issue depending upon? Because we don't have that many refugees in St. Louis County. It isn't as if there's an abundance of them. So how would you characterize their nervousness or their concern? What was it based
I
on?
think they were reflecting the anxiety of their constituency who are facing the changing economics on the Iron Range, and who generally they're fearful. There's a lot of fear and anxiety about things that are going to change, about the economics of the area, about the dependency on the heavy mining, on people from outside that area. What if they come in and sort of overwhelm the systems? So I think that it was those kinds of anxieties that are present among their constituents that were being reflected in the commissioners from the Iron Range.
Thank you. Do you see any justification for limiting the number of immigrants into the United States, or do we just have totally open borders?
I do not espouse open borders, simply open borders. I think we need to be mindful of security issues. I think we need to be mindful of trafficking and narcotics and contraband that comes across the border. And I think we have to look at what our capacity is as well. It's not going to help anybody if we end up with a situation where our systems, our health systems, our educational systems, our medical systems are totally overwhelmed. So I don't espouse open borders, but I espouse a more supportive and generous process by which those persons who come can be welcomed and integrated into our life. And if you look at the information that was in the most recent lecture, the third lecture in this series, there's good reason to say we actually need immigration because of our own population stagnation.
Well, that leads into the next question, which I'll read you the heart of it. It begins with a compliment to you. Enjoyed your talk. I should read that. But is there any discussion in your work about convincing the regulators and the powerful lobbies, the business interests, that immigration reform will benefit the economy?
I'm not good at quoting a lot of statistics, but I can tell you that I listened to Senator Mendoza, and prior to his introduction of the Citizenship Act to Congress, it was like about, I'm going to say like maybe it was February 12th. It was about a week before that. He gave a major address to a large business association, making the case that we really needed immigration reform to benefit corporate and business interests. And if somebody's seriously interested in that question, I would refer them to that speech. I wouldn't want to try to repeat it here. And I don't remember the statistics well enough. It's not something that I tried to incorporate into my work. But I do know that there are people in favor of this legislation who are undertaking that task.
I understood the question to be partly as a strategy too. Maybe instead of going into the streets, you need to go into the boardrooms.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, so you would agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yes.
Well, let me.
Corporations of business are a major player in our country and,
sure.
and a major decision maker.
Okay, I'm going to change the subject again, but this is sort of following up on a question that was asked a little while ago. What's your view on the rising topic of global warming in the United States and the idea of being able to sustain more immigrants, strictly on environmental grounds? Can the land support more people? I guess that's the sense of the question.
Yeah. I think the land can support more people if we learn to live more sustainably. I think there's room for us to learn to live in a way that will allow more people to be a part of our life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about?
And the converse of that is also true, that if we don't learn to live sustainably, even those of us who are currently here will have a threat to our lives and livelihoods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thoughts, this is a question, your thoughts on the US citizenship test, should it be changed in any way? I guess the implication is, does it have some built-in biases?
I haven't sat down and looked at it with that question in mind. The question may come from that perspective, or it may come from the fact that one of Trump's last orders was a change in the citizenship test, and it went from sort of a relatively basic civics test to a much more complicated and longer exam. And that was one of the things that has been rolled back, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I keep going back and forth now to various topics we keep revisiting, but I think that's the nature of this Zoom business, because now we're back to business again. Do you think some businesses support limiting legal immigration, limiting it, because that way they can pay undocumented workers less? Do you think that's a problem?
Not only can they pay them less, they hire them even though that's against the law.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are business people for whom the bottom line is the ultimate priority, and
Mm-hmm. So you've got two problems that I think you've identified in the way of standing in the way of immigration reform. One of them are business interests, maybe, and the other one is just anxiety, fear. Is that a fair characterization of what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think the fear and anxiety in this country gets acted out against Black and brown and Indigenous persons, and right now, that's the population that comes to us.
Mm-hmm. Apparently, I'm paraphrasing a question here, but apparently in Biden's approach, or in his legislative proposals, he's calling for more guest workers. Is this similar to the previous Bracero program, and what's your attitude about that?
I think we do need more guest worker visas. And so I don't know that it's parallel, because in the Bracero program, there weren't protections for those workers. And I would guess that the current legislation proposals would have more protections for the workers than was present in the Bracero program.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a question from a newcomer to Duluth. Wonders, besides your committee for migrant justice, is there a way a person who could be made aware here in Duluth of how that person may help any refugees or immigrants that come here? How will we even become aware of immigrants who need help?
I think that's part of the problem. That's what I was trying to say about Duluth. We don't have an identifiable community of folks, because folks come and they generally come with a purpose and with some connections. You know, they've been recruited by the hospital, or they're teaching at the university, or they're studying at one of the schools, or they're working for one of our commercial enterprises. And so they're not so visible. During the pandemic, I contacted Susan Paola Woodward at University of Minnesota, Duluth. She's the officer now that works with diversity and international students. And there have been a couple of times when I've approached her to say things like, hey, are there DACA students that are in need of some assistance? Are there international students? You know, some of them during the lockdown, they couldn't leave because they didn't know if they'd be able to come back. And so we were able to make some connections to help provide some just basic groceries and things like that for some of those students. But there's no central place. Another place one could talk to, one talks to basically individuals about things like this. The school system does have an English learner program in their continuing ed, adult ed division. And so there have been some times when I've connected with that office and said, you know, we're here and are there some things that we can do to be of assistance? So that the official, we tend to conflate the word immigrant and refugee. Refugee is a particular status, and part of the requirements for refugee resettlement is that it happen within 150 miles of a resettlement office. And the closest resettlement office is in the Twin Cities. So we're beyond, one of the reasons we don't have refugees here is because we're beyond that 150-mile limit. And in fact, I think it's been since, I'd want to go back and look at the figures, but I think we've had one refugee resettle here, and it was a family connected member since 2012. So we don't have refugees here. If we would increase the number of refugees, it might be that we could open an office here. LIRS, for example, or LSS had an office at one time here. And if there was a concerted effort to bring refugees to the United States, maybe some of those offices that have been closed for a while would be open, and then that would change the picture.
I remember that well. Lutheran Social Service you're talking about. They worked with families who were taking Vietnamese and Hmong people in particular at that time.
Right. The new legislation, the proposed legislation, does have funding for increasing partnerships with nonprofits and to expand. That's what that comment is about, expanding the partner organizations to resettle and prepare for citizenship. So, you know, if I'm not optimistic about this legislation being accepted as a package, but if that piece of it were somehow included, then I think we would see a ramp up in those partner organizations and offices opening, and then communities could speak up and be supportive.
What we are doing here in this country, whether we want to or not, partly because of the 1965 legislation, is we are building a multicultural society, for better or for worse, are we not? And there are other countries that are following that path. I'm thinking of Canada. We learned about that last month, and New Zealand and Australia, and other countries in Europe. So other countries are facing similar issues one way or another. Do you have any idea about how we are measuring up to other countries in handling immigrants?
My impression is not so well. That's an impression, and it's based on the last 4 years where there's been concerted effort to decrease the number of foreign-born persons who are here. If you ask that question 4 years from now, I would hope we could have a different answer, but I don't know.
Okay, do you know what else? You have answered all the questions I have received. And if I don't get any more, then I think maybe you've fulfilled your duties very nicely.
I do want to say that I was aware that there would probably be questions about Biden and the proposals, because that's the most current. I will also say that getting information about that has been a kind of a recent endeavor, because it wasn't widely publicized or assessed in news media until the last 4 weeks. And most of the last year, what I've really been doing is studying more of the history that you heard about the racism that I believe has been embedded in the system and that we need to be alert to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again very much for your contribution. I think it was prodigious. And I appreciate your time and the local voice that you've given to this whole endeavor all year, all these lectures. I would remind the audience and remind Charlotte, now you can go back and be an audience again, because on the 23rd of March, we have a woman from Texas who wrote a really interesting book where she visited a whole series of immigrants from a variety of different cultures, Vietnamese, Mexican, all over the place, Southern Europe, and of course from Asia, and found out coping skills that they were using as immigrants to settle into our culture. And the title of her book and the title of her talk is What We Can Learn from the Newcomers, what the immigrants can teach us. So stay tuned for number 5. But you get a good mark from me for number 4. Thank you very much, Charlotte, Frantz, and thank you all very much for coming to this lecture.
Tom, can I just add that Facebook users are certainly welcome to follow ICMJ Twin Ports, I think is the way it's expressed on Facebook. And we do, I think, a fairly consistent job of trying to put posts that we pick up to keep people like learning. It's mostly an educational tool, but it's also an event tool. And then people can reach out to individuals within the organization through that Facebook page if they like.
Okay. That's fair. A little commercial at the end is okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all again, all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening. See you again in this spot on the 23rd of March. Good night, everybody.